welcome once again to EWTN's Bookmark. I'm Doug Keck, your host. Our guest author is Dr. Hendershott, author of The Politics of Envy, published by Crisis Publications, available through the EWTN Religious Catalog, EWTNRC.com. All those books are Catholic. And it's great to have you here.
Thanks,
on EWTN's Bookmark and to be back again. Your day job is what?
Well, I'm a professor of sociology at Franciscan, but I also direct what's called the Veritas Center for Ethics in Public Life. So we bring in speakers and write articles about what's going on, contemporary issues.
Now, you're a sociologist?
Right.
In
yes.
training. Now, a lot of people blame some of the sociologists for why we have so many problems to begin with. How did you decide to get on the right path?
Well, I'm an old school sociology, very old school. And sociology as a discipline in the beginning was created by actually very holy, devout, faithful men who wanted to understand the world and try to bring order to chaos. And so I became a sociologist thinking that's what sociology was. Because in the old days, it was. In the 70s, the early 70s, late 60s, early 70s, sociology was a conservative discipline. It's hard to believe. We did demography, we studied data, we looked at birth rates, death rates. We were a boring discipline, and I loved it because I always wanted to understand why people did what they do. Right. And that was, I went from psychology to sociology because psychology was all about the brain. I wanted to understand behavior. And so that's how I got into sociology. But now the discipline is kind of lost. Right. It's lost its way. They're not helping us understand our current predicament at all, I'm afraid.
Well, let me ask you, it's the politics of envy. So what do you mean the politics of envy? We know envy is one of the 7 deadly sins, and we're aware of it, but what are the politics of it and why today?
Well, politics is about power, and envy, to me, is about a desire for power. And I decided to write the book because I just saw a lot of the political rhetoric we were seeing emerged from envy, or was a call to envy. And that worries me. And that's really one of the reasons I wrote the book. I just saw lots of crimes of envy, lots of politics of envy. The lead up to the 2020 election was all about envy. It really could have been a study in envy. And I write about that. The demagogues really were attracting people to the idea that they needed a leveling of society, and that if they were elected, they would elevate the poor and bring down the rich. And so you had Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, all of them. They were like in a fight to see who could bid the most for envy and get the most voters. They were really making an appeal to envy.
Well, I guess the question is, how does one differentiate then between fair and equitable situations in life versus saying it's envy?
Well, I know, because there is such a thing as justice, and we all want justice. And that's saying no peace, no justice, right? We know that. But in terms of justice, we have to look at what really is just. And envious people, they don't look at justice in that way. They look at a leveling to bring everyone down so there's nothing left to envy. That's their goal, really. And that's the goal of socialism. And so this whole idea of democratic socialism is really a bid to level everyone to, except for the people in charge of the party, as always happens.
Somebody has to be in charge.
I know. And they won't have to suffer under this leveling. They won't be leveled. In fact, even the Sandinistas, when they marched into Managua after the revolution, they took all the nice houses for themselves, the generals did. And that's what happens when you have this kind of revolution based on envy. This promise of leveling is never fulfilled. People suffer, but not the party leaders.
I thought it was interesting to be introduction. You say Joseph Epstein writes that of the deadly sins, only envy is no fun at all. You also go to say, in some ways, envy is the worst of the deadly sins. You were alluding to this before because it leads to so many other. Also, that the resentment that accompanies envy often erupts as anger and resentful rage, and inextricably intertwined with pride. And I think that's where sort of what you were alluding to as well, in this world, we're kind of saying, in trying to talk about what's fair for everybody, some parts of it, sometimes even from a religious perspective, it seems like we're preying on people's envy.
We are. Unfortunately, I think even the bid to social justice, and I know the Catholic Church often talks about social justice, and social justice can be a good thing, but when it's defined so broadly as to give a woman a right to full reproductive rights, that's viewed as social justice for some people.
Right.
And not allowing a woman to get an abortion is viewed as, a violation of social justice. That's crazy. So we have to be careful how we define social justice.
Right.
And to me, social justice has been distorted so badly that it really is a code for socialism.
Right.
And I worry that the church could move in that direction because some of the rhetoric already is.
Right, yeah. It's tough to differentiate. You say envy derives from the Latin word invidia, which means non-sight. That's kind of interesting. So it derives from the idea, in a sense, of a form of blindness.
It is. Yeah, and I think Dante says it best. In his book, one of the circles of hell holds the envious. And the penitents in purgatory have to have their eyes sewn shut so that they can't see others. Their eyes are sewn shut with wire, according to Dante.
Right, sure.
But to me, it's very revealing that envy can be a blindness. I think it is a blindness because you fail to see the good parts of other people. You only see what you think they shouldn't have. Envy is about seeing something that you either want or you just don't want that person to have.
Right, that you believe you should have, or if you don't get it, they certainly shouldn't have had it.
Yeah.
Envy continues to inspire the creation of dysfunctional political systems designed to remove privilege and honor from the few, dispersing it to the many. Marxism, the pernicious theory that still motivates many within academia and beyond, is based entirely on envy.
It really is. Now, my friends who have leaned towards socialism would completely disagree with that. But I don't know how they can disagree with it, because the rhetoric that surrounds Marxism and socialism is all about envy. Calling them fat cats, soak the rich, the riots are all about envy. I believe that the riots that we're experiencing, certainly there are issues, certainly, but a lot of it has to do with envy. In any of the protests that we've seen in the past, I was living in California during the Rodney King riots, and they remind me so much of the current riots because the Rodney King riots were related to police brutality.
Right.
A motorist was stopped and beaten terribly.
It was a horrible incident. Right.
Horrible incident. And then the police officers were not found guilty.
Right.
And so that triggered riots. But the riots, I understand the protests, but then they devolved into this envious rage against Korean business owners. And that's what's happening. A lot of rioting is sort of payback from envious people who want to destroy the businesses of those with more. And that's what we saw in 1992 when most of the businesses that were torched and destroyed were Korean businesses. And we see that in New York, we're seeing it in Portland.
Yeah, sometimes people use these events to settle old scores and other situations that are there. You say history has shown that envy increases in communist countries because the stakes become so small that even the slightest advantages are envied.
Yeah, there are some cultures that give rise to more envy than others. And any of the Soviet Union, a lot of Latin America, Venezuela, huge envy culture there. In fact, when Hugo Chavez died, some people said, oh, it was unfulfilled. And The Nation did an article saying that he wasn't autocratic enough. He needed to clamp down more. I read about that.
It's always the same thing.
Yes.
We just didn't
Didn't
do
go
enough.
far enough.
We didn't go far enough and do enough of it.
If only we'd done that.
Yeah, it reminds me of there's kind of a business thing that I've always experienced is with the smaller the cheese, the more vicious the rats. It seems like the opposite.
I like
when
that
there's
saying.
plenty,
I wish I'd used
when
that.
there's plenty, but when there's little, it's amazing.
When it's just little. And that's why academia, I have a whole chapter about envy in academia.
Right.
Because the stakes are very small.
I was going to ask you, why is, they're the communists, the socialists, it's the big push.
Academics are very envious. I have a whole chapter about academic mobbing.
Yeah, what is mobbing? You talk about
Yeah,
this. in the
mobbing
book.
it's sort of like, it's kind of like cancel culture in that if there's a very high status person on campus, and mobbing is not my original word, it was used in several books by a man named Westhues who wrote about academic mobbing. High status professors are very vulnerable to being mobbed. Now, I've never been mobbed. It's the real high status professors, and I write about them here by
Anthony
name.
Esselin,
Anthony
you talk
Esselin
about,
is
yeah,
one
right,
of those
right.
at Providence. People are very envious of him, and they kind of wait in the weeds for him to write something that they don't
Some
like, and they
misstep,
can
they can,
mobilize.
right, turn it into a bigger
and that's
issue
what
and-
happened. He wrote a couple of articles critical of a bias response team at his university, at his college, and this crowd, this mob, and the word mobbing is fascinating to me because it comes from the bird world. Entomologists use it to describe.
Well, the birds with the hawks, you talk about it
Yes,
here.
I
Very
write about
interesting,
that.
right,
It's very
right.
interesting because little birds can gang up on a hawk and take down the hawk.
As
They
long
could
as he's a
actually-
big enough hawk.
Yes, not a little bird,
Little
a little
hawk,
hawk that
yeah.
could spry enough to
Right,
have them for
that's
lunch.
interesting, right.
But if a bunch of little birds, and I saw that in our home, we had a home on the water in Milford, and mating season especially, these little songbirds would gang up on this big, strong bird of prey, and I couldn't imagine. So I had to do some research. And that term, mobbing, I've seen on several Catholic campuses where I've worked, not Franciscan. I'm blessed to be at a faithful school where I don't see that, but I have taught at other campuses, San Diego, and saw mobbing behavior and experienced it, where a high status faculty member threatens others with his output or her output, it's usually male, and all the other little birds gang up and try to take him down. And they're often successful,
Right.
often.
Now you quote Solzhenitsyn here. You say he knew that even in a society in which all rewards are routinized and scrupulously administered to ensure equality, there are still going to be those with more, and those who can acquire more through violence.
Yeah, that's the danger with envy. I have a whole chapter of crimes of envy. The one that is most poignant to me is, and really what triggered me to do this book, because I was thinking about envy after this case. We live in Connecticut and got the New York Post, and they had this series on this horrible murder. They called it the nanny murders.
I remember, right,
Yeah,
sure. And you talk about it in the book,
woman.
right.
Yeah, I write about it.
The girl from England.
Yes,
Right.
she worked for these two parents who had three beautiful children and loved the children and took very good care of them, and they loved the nanny. She was 50 years old. She's from the Dominican. She had a child back in the Dominican, and all those years that she was working for this family, she developed this envious resentment toward them. Even though they were very good to her, they gave her vacations back to the Dominican. They even accompanied her once and met her family. One day she just broke
Right.
and murdered two of the children,
Right.
while the mother was out picking up the third child at swim lessons, so that when the mother came home with the child, her children were dying. This is a horrible story. I shouldn't even disturb
But it's
your-
interesting because it does play into that idea of even in a nanny state, no one likes to ultimately be beholding to other people.
That's what it is.
And ultimately it becomes the, why should you have what I should have,
That's what it was.
right?
She even said it, and the judge used the word envy, and the prosecutors used the word envy, and I was shocked by that because I paid a lot of attention. I got transcripts from the case, and the word envy was mentioned dozens of times in her trial. You don't see that usually in a trial, and I thought, wow, this is interesting to me. So that happened in 2018, and it kind of put a seed in my head. I'm seeing envy. I'm seeing envy here. I'm seeing it there. I see it on college campuses. I see it in the news. Then I saw it in the election, in the lead up to the election in 2020.
Well, it seems to some degree is that envy comes out of also the idea that I should have this,
Yes.
and I don't, so there must be something wrong, in which case it's your fault or somebody else's fault that I don't have it. So the idea that some will have more and some will have less gets put away, and because I have less, it's somebody's fault.
Exactly, and that's why it's related to pride, and I'm glad you read that in the beginning. It's very prideful, and that's why they say pride is the worst sin, but
Right.
envy is so closely allied to pride.
Right,
That if you're prideful,
well, I
it's
should
me.
have, and I
Yes,
don't
it's-
have,
yeah.
and there's something wrong in this
Exactly.
equation. And we live in a society today, and we hear it all the time, quite honestly, where basically you were held back. You haven't achieved, or you haven't this because other people have done this to you. So you are owed something. And even in society in general, the idea of what we believe the government in theory or the country owes me, you know what I mean, leads to that envy, because when that's not fulfilled, somebody must be to blame.
Right, and it creates this resentment. The original resentment related to envy is resentiment, meaning that same emotion is like played over and over in your head, just like you're saying.
Right.
And I'm seeing it everywhere. I mean, the guillotine that was erected in front of Jeff Bezos' house, the Amazon CEO,
Right.
there was a guillotine by a former employee, a man named Small, which I thought was an appropriate name for him, because he was angry that he didn't make more money. And so he put this guillotine. But I'm seeing guillotines everywhere. I mean, there was a candidate for office from Maine who was running for the Senate, Bree Kidman, and her campaign literature was emblazoned with a guillotine. Her T-shirts had a guillotine on it. That's like their, you know, that's scary to me.
Right. Well, that moves to this level of retribution, and that's basically
Right.
evil.
Kill the rich.
Right. Now you say, and here, we have seen envy as a contributor to World War II's genocide of European Jewry in the Holocaust. And of course, because not only was there the anti-Semitism that was there to begin with, but there was also all of that property. All those things were taken
All
down.
those apartments.
Certainly, Hitler himself had an anti-Semitic envy
He did.
of the Jews he experienced in Vienna, if you read about his life,
Yeah.
when he tried to get into art school and couldn't get in. And also, this was interesting, the Rwandan genocide, when more than 1 million Tutsis were slaughtered during the Rwandan Civil War. And that's where there were two classes, there was three classes of people, 3 or 4 in the country, but these two,
The
and
Hutu
one
and
had
the
kind of been indoctrinated into running the country as a colony, and the others were tended to be the farmers.
Right.
And so, like you said, once it broke open, there was a lot of old scores
Resentment.
being settled.
Resentment.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, resentment and envy are twinned. And yeah, most people don't think of, I'm glad that you understand that the Holocaust and the Rwanda massacre both had envy running through
Right.
them.
There were other causes.
Of course.
But once it opened the door, there's
Yes.
an
The
opportunity.
resentment
it expands
built
out.
so much.
sometimes I think it's even, we have to be careful, because maybe the original concern is real and needs to be dealt with, but it can easily be exploited that way.
Right, because it appeals to this evil impulse.
Right.
That, I mean, we see it in the Bible. Christians know that there's, Adam and Eve were envious of God's power, and they were tempted by that. Satan saying, you could have this,
Sure.
you know?
In fact, you deserve
You
it.
should have this, yes.
What are you waiting for?
Yeah.
You say, according to most sociologists, emotions are created and constantly reshaped by the beliefs, attitudes, and values that individuals acquire in the course of their socialization. What in the socialization is going on in our culture today that's leading to this amount of envy?
Well, I think social media is a problem. I think Facebook and Twitter and all of that, Instagram, they're contributors. But I think it even goes back further. We aren't teaching our children about envy. Now, when my children were small, I read Grimm's fairy tales, and they're pretty grim. I mean, and they almost always have a lesson of envy. What happens to envy? You know, from Sleeping Beauty to Cinderella, the ugly stepsisters are ugly because they're envious, really. They're envious of Cinderella's goodness and beauty, and they want to put that slipper on their foot. And in the original Grimm's, they have to cut their toes off to try to get there.
Right.
So I have a whole chapter on fairy tales and envy. Bible stories, but we're not teaching children that. Most of our children today aren't hearing fairy tales. I mean, I taught my children, you probably taught your children, that bad things happen when you envy and you try to take things away from people.
Right, and that's not the way you go and achieve it. It should make you want to
Exactly.
strive so you can achieve what
Right,
it is.
get your own.
And the other thing is that you have no understanding at all what that other person has sacrificed or done to achieve
Get
that
there.
in the
I
first
know.
place.
Shakespeare is valuable, but now we're doing away with Shakespeare because he's one of those white males that we have to. But Shakespeare's filled with stories of envy.
Right, exactly.
You know,
I thought this was interesting. Overall, young people reported more frequently feeling envious over physical attractiveness or romance, as well as achievements at school and social success. In contrast, older people, especially men in their 40s and 50s, envy monetary success and occupational success in others. I remember, I think it's elsewhere in the book, you talk about how girls are envious of other girls.
yeah.
And guys
males are envious of others. Yeah, we tend
other
not
guys.
to.
Interesting.
And people of our own age and people of our own profession. I mean, Aristotle talks about that really, that it's an issue of propinquity. We tend not to envy like a big movie star who has a big house. That's nice. But if our next door neighbor puts in a pool and we don't have one, then that could be a cause of envy.
It's interesting too, because I used to always think, in the 1930s, people watched movies in this big screen, and these Hollywood stars, it was another world.
Right.
Television brought it and made it small, and suddenly it seemed like they were the same as me, and what they had should be the same as me. So this separation of thinking, well, that's great, but I'd never have that, becomes, why don't I have that?
Yeah, it is. And there's a chapter on, it's called The Other Directed Man. Really good book. The Lonely Crowd was published in the early 60s. And it talked about how we became outer directed, seeing what others had and wanting it. But social media opens the door to see much more. People post their elaborate vacations, and that can create tremendous envy. And it has created tremendous envy. There's a whole chapter on social media.
Right.
But I mean, we had envy way before social media.
Right. But it can
Exacerbate
focus
it.
it in a lot of ways. And the origins of envy. In this section here, you talk about the early church fathers, including St. Cyprian, the Bishop of Carthage in the early part of the 3rd century, was the first to warn that envy is the root of all evil, the foundation of disasters, the nursery of crimes, the material of transgressions. He saw Jesus' exhortations in loneliness as an attempt to keep envy at bay. Cyprian warns that envy was a gnawing worm of the soul. When we hate our neighbor for his prosperity, when we make other people's glory our penalty.
Yeah, that's painful, isn't it, to read it? That's so true. But who reads that anymore? I'm glad you did. Thank you. But we're not reminded of that when we go to church. I mean, I don't hear that in a homily about envy. You tend not to hear that. And if we're not reading it in the Bible, I mean, there's so much in the Bible. Joseph and his brothers, Cain and Abel, the original murder, really, was over envy. Abel was making more pleasing sacrifices to God, and Cain wasn't doing so well. So instead of trying to do a better sacrifice, go out and get his own lamb to sacrifice to our Father, he kills his brother because he didn't want his brother to have this wonderful relationship with God. There's such a thing as faith envy, too. I've seen it myself. I think sometimes people are envious of those with faith, and they've lost theirs. I think a lot of the anti-Catholicism and anti-Christianity we're seeing is people who at one time had faith and then just lost it. That's a sad one for me.
Right. You also talk about here about the fact that anxiety overtook depression as the #1 concern on college campuses in 2009. Why is
Isn't
that
that
important?
sad? Well, I think social media.
But
The idea
why
of
do you think it
keeping up.
matters that anxiety took over depression? So why are people more anxious than
The
depressed?
uncertainty about who they are and their place in the world, and a decline in religion and meaning in life. If the only meaning we have in life is our social status, then we're in big trouble, because
Right.
it can never be enough.
And because your status is totally based on what other people perceive it to be.
Exactly.
Right.
I know. Instead of what God perceives it to be. And that's why I wanted a Catholic publisher, and I'm so grateful to Crisis for publishing this, because I don't think you can talk about envy in a purely secular way. Because I think envy grows when belief in God declines, and belief in an all-powerful God the way we Christians view him, one who sacrificed his life for us.
Right. Now, we talk about here in the section envy as a path of political power, and you talk about demagogues earlier. You say those who greedy may ruin their own lives, but those who are envious contaminate the larger community by letting their covetousness interfere with their relations with others.
Oh yeah, I think envy can take down a whole society. It can destroy a community, it can destroy a school, and it can destroy a society. It could destroy a country. It could destroy our country. I worry about that because we are being led by demagogues right now who appeal to the baser instincts, appeal to our sinful nature, because we all are sinful. We know that.
But that's part of the problem. We're living in a culture who believes that people are basically good and that structures make them bad. And they lose sight of original sin, which is what makes it problematic for why their systems never work. Just before we go, it says here, secular atheist ideology has grown over the past decades, distorts our understanding of reality. Those distortions work to hide the true goal of politics under atheism, which is, of course, power. Once God is banished, we become creatures not of God, but of society, politics. And we have then the choice either to rule or be ruled.
That worries me, because most people want to rule.
Right.
Not everybody can rule.
Absolutely. That's not how the pyramid works.
No.
Very good. Do you have another book in the works?
I do. I'm revisiting Catholic higher education.
Okay.
So I hope I come back again.
Is it the envy of academia? Are you going to expand on
No.
that? Okay. Very good. Thank you, Ann
Thank you.
Hendershott. The book, The Politics of Envy, so much more included, published by Crisis, available through the EWTN Religious Catalog, EWTNRC.com for all things Catholic. This is Bookmark. We shall see you next time.